In 1974, a man emerged from the jungle on a remote Philippine island carrying a rifle, ammunition, and a sword. He was wearing a tattered but carefully maintained military uniform. He was lean, weathered, and alert. He moved through the trees the way a soldier moves, carefully, watching everything. His name was Hiroo Onoda. He was a lieutenant in the Imperial Japanese Army, and he had been fighting the Second World War for 29 years after it ended. Nobody had told him it was over. To understand how this happened, you need to understand who Hiroo Onoda was and what he believed. Onoda was born in 1922 in Japan. He was intelligent, disciplined, and deeply patriotic. He joined the Imperial Japanese Army as a young man and trained as an intelligence officer, one of the most elite roles in the military. He was taught not just to fight, but to think, to survive, to operate behind enemy lines independently for extended periods. In 1944, as the war in the Pacific turned increasingly against Japan, Onoda was sent to Lubang Island in the Philippines. His orders were explicit and unwavering. He was to conduct guerrilla warfare against Allied forces. He was to use the jungle as cover. He was to harass and disrupt the enemy at every opportunity. And then came the order that would define the rest of his life. Under no circumstances was he to surrender. Under no circumstances was he to take his own life. He was to fight until he received direct orders from a superior officer to stop. No other authority, no leaflet, no newspaper, no radio broadcast, no Filipino civilian was to be trusted or believed. Those orders were given in 1944. Onoda followed them for the next 30 years. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, ending the Second World War, Onoda was deep in the jungle of Lubang Island. He had no radio. He had no reliable contact with the outside world. And when leaflets were dropped into the jungle announcing Japan's surrender and ordering all soldiers to lay down their arms, Onoda read them and concluded they were enemy propaganda. This was not stupidity. This was exactly the kind of psychological warfare he had been trained to expect. The enemy, he had been taught, would try anything to make Japanese soldiers give up. Fake surrender announcements, false newspapers, fabricated orders. He had been specifically warned about this, so he kept fighting. For the first few years, Onoda was not alone. He had 3 other soldiers with him, Yuichi Akatsu, Siochi Shimada, and Kinshichi Kozuka. Together they formed a small guerrilla unit, living off the land, raiding villages for food and supplies, engaging in skirmishes with Filipino police and military patrols. To the people of Lubang Island, they were not forgotten soldiers fighting a war that had ended. They were a genuine and deadly threat. Over the course of nearly 30 years, Onoda and his small band killed approximately 30 Filipino civilians and wounded 100 more. They burned crops, they destroyed property, they ambushed patrols. They believed they were fighting a war. The people they were killing believed the war had ended in 1945. One by one, Onoda's companions left him. Akatsu surrendered in 1950, 5 years after the war ended. He walked out of the jungle, gave himself up, and tried to tell Onoda and the others that Japan had truly surrendered. Onoda did not believe him. He concluded Akatsu had been captured and broken. Shimada was shot and killed by a search party in 1954. Kozuka was shot and killed by Filipino police in 1972, 27 years after the war ended. And then Onoda was alone. He continued, "Think about what this means." By 1972, Onoda had been alone in that jungle for years. He had watched his last companion die. He was 50 years old. He had spent the majority of his adult life fighting a war in a jungle, eating whatever he could find, maintaining his rifle with obsessive care, sewing patches onto his uniform, sharpening his sword. He had received no confirmation that the war continued, but he had received no orders to stop. And without orders to stop, he would not stop. That was who he was. That was what he had been made into. In 1959, Japan had officially declared him legally dead. He didn't know. Japan had not forgotten Hiroo Onoda. For decades, search parties had been sent to Lubang Island. Leaflets had been dropped. Photographs of his family had been left in the jungle. Letters from his parents, written in his mother's handwriting, had been placed in locations where he might find them. Onoda found them. He concluded they were forgeries. In 1972, after Kazuka was killed and identified, the Japanese government launched a major new effort to find Onoda. His family recorded messages. Former commanding officers recorded appeals. They were broadcast over loudspeakers at the jungle's edge. Onoda heard them. He concluded they were recordings made under duress or fabrications designed to break his will. The tragedy of Hiroo Onoda is not that he was stupid. It is that he was exactly as good a soldier as he had been trained to be. He had been told to trust nothing except direct orders from a superior officer. He applied that instruction with perfect consistency for 30 years. Every piece of evidence that the war was over was filtered through a belief system that had been deliberately constructed to reject exactly that kind of evidence. He was a man who could not be reached by anything except the one thing that never came: his commanding officer standing in front of him and giving him the order to stand down. In 1974, a young Japanese adventurer named Norio Suzuki traveled to Lubang Island. He was 24 years old, idealistic, and had announced to friends that he was going to find Hiroo Onoda. Most people thought he was foolish. The Japanese government had spent years trying to find Onoda with trained search parties and had failed. What could one young man with a backpack do? Suzuki walked into the jungle and started looking. Within days, he found Onoda. The two men talked. Suzuki told Onoda the war was over. Onoda told Suzuki he would not stand down without orders from a superior officer. Suzuki asked what it would take for Onoda to come out. Onoda explained. His commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, would need to come to the island in person and give him the order to cease fighting. Nothing else would do. Suzuki returned to Japan and found Major Taniguchi. Taniguchi was 70 years old. He had left the military and was working in a bookshop. When he learned that Onoda was still alive and still fighting in the jungle, he agreed immediately to go to the Philippines. On the 9th of March 1974, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi stood in a clearing on Lubang Island and read out the official order. The Imperial Japanese Army's 14th Area Army had ceased all combat activity. Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda was to lay down his arms. Onoda stood at attention. He listened to every word. And then he did something that shocked the witnesses present. He wept. Hiroo Onoda emerged from the jungle carrying his rifle, his ammunition, his sword, and a dagger his mother had given him 30 years earlier with instructions to use it on himself rather than be captured. He had carried it for 3 decades and never used it. He surrendered formally to the President of the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos, who pardoned him for his actions during his 30 years in the jungle. The world watched in astonishment. Here was a man who had given everything, his youth, his relationships, his freedom, 3 decades of his life, to a cause that had ended before he was 30 years old. A man whose loyalty was so absolute, so perfectly constructed, that nothing in 30 years had been able to break it. In Japan, reaction was complicated. Some saw him as a hero, the ultimate expression of duty and honor. Others felt profound sadness at a life consumed by a war that everyone else had moved on from long ago. Onoda himself struggled to adjust to a world that had changed beyond recognition. Japan was no longer the country he had left. The war he had fought was history. The enemy he had been fighting was now an ally. He moved to Brazil for several years, unable to fully reconcile himself with modern Japan. He eventually returned, set up an outdoor education school for young people, and spent the rest of his life teaching survival skills and the values of discipline and perseverance. He died in 2014 at the age of 91. In one of his last interviews, Hiroo Onoda was asked whether he regretted the 30 years he had spent in the jungle. He thought for a long moment before answering. He said he did not regret following his orders. He said that was who he was, and he could not have been any other way. But he said he was deeply sorry for the people of Lubang Island, for the lives lost and the suffering caused. That regret, he said, he would carry for the rest of his life. A soldier who fought for 30 years after the war ended, who killed people who knew the war was over, who was finally brought home not by governments or search parties or the passing of time, but by one young man with a backpack who simply decided to go and look. Some wars end with a treaty, some end with a bomb, and some end in a jungle clearing 30 years late, when an old man finally hears the words he has been waiting for. Stand down.